Iain, should Lord Ken Clarke, former Health Secretary, be stripped of his peerage after a blood inquiry concluded he has misled the public and rebuked him for his combative style when he gave evidence to the inquiry?
Now, the infected blood inquiry report was highly critical of the Conservative peer and former Health Secretary, accusing him of misleading the public about the risks posed by blood transfusions. The inquiry's chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, said Lord Clarke's words gave false reassurance to people. Now, he was Health Minister, I think, for several years in the 1980s and then became Health Secretary, so he was at the core of what went on. And I have to say, when I watched some of the evidence that he gave to the inquiry, I thought it was verging on the flippant. Alex Salmond.
Well, certainly, Ken Clarke didn't do himself any favours with his insouciance at the inquiry and the manner in which he treated it as if he was in the House of Commons and the rest of it. I'd have to say that if Ken Clarke was to be punished or stripped of his peerage, then you'd have to do something to just about every health minister and every prime minister for the last 40 years. Maybe that's no bad thing, and I've certainly called for that for one or two of them for other reasons. But the whole sorry tale has been one of people ducking responsibility, refusing to face up to the issue, and refusing to do what should have been done. I congratulate Sir Brian Langstaff. I set up the inquiry in Scotland, and it didn't have the same success in getting to the bottom of the issue, partly because, of course, there was no cooperation from the government down here. They refused to cooperate. We know from documents. Why? Well, because he didn't want the inquiry to spread south. Lord Penrose, I think, came up against obstacles. He didn't have the powers to compel witnesses and documents from down here. We've seen government briefings to say to MPs, why there shouldn't be an English inquiry to match the Scottish inquiry. But again, I'm not incidentally saying that the Health Department of Scotland are blameless. On the contrary, I think they had the same attitude of say nothing, admit nothing, admit no liability. And so my first thing is to congratulate Brian Langstaff in getting to the bottom of it. I think a lot of ex-ministers should hang their heads in shame. The only reason I wouldn't say that Ken Clarke should be singled out for punishment is actually he's the one that came to the inquiry to defend his position. He defended the indefensible, but if you punished him, you'd have to punish every health secretary and every prime minister for the last 40 years.
Let me play devil's advocate, because you must have had occasions as First Minister where you had made a decision on the basis of the evidence provided to you by your civil servants, and then later come to regret it because that advice turned out to be wrong, erroneous, ill-judged, whatever. But the buck still had to stop with you because you were at the top of the political tree. Now, over a number of decades, certainly in the Thatcher and Major governments this happened, but then of course Tony Blair also. He refused to have an inquiry about, I think, 2001, something like that.
I can also tell you that the Brown government were not delighted that I went ahead with the public inquiry in Scotland. On the contrary, they were spitting, I was going to say spitting blood, but that'd been
but it's also a bit like Ed Davey being blamed for a lot of the post office scandal, where he was post office minister. He was reassured by his officials that...
stopped, but nonetheless, the tradition, as you rightly say, is that ministers take responsibility and civil servants get off with it. The point I'm making about Ken Clarke, who I've got a huge soft spot for, because we all find his attitude refreshing at times. He was ill-judged in saying what he said at the inquiry because it didn't seem to take into account the extent of the suffering and the impact on 30,000 people, of course 3,000 of whom are now dead, and what they've had to endure over the last 40 years. But the culture of secrecy wasn't specific to England. It was there in Scotland as well. The one thing I can say is at least the Scottish Government back in 2007 decided to set up an inquiry and try to do something about it. But it's Sir Brian Langstaff who's nailed it and has absolutely, with the powers he had...
But to answer the question, should Ken Clarke have his peerage removed?
No, because you'd have to do it to everyone else, and you can't single out one person when so many are guilty.
Caroline Lucas.
Well, I certainly think heads need to roll. I think there needs to be accountability, and I think that needs to be seen by the victims of this horrendous scandal. So the individual question of Ken Clarke, I haven't read enough of the report to know how fair it is to single him out, to know how much he was simply going on what he was told, and whether there were moments when he really should have known what was going on and yet didn't come clean when he gave his evidence. So I feel I don't yet know enough about his particular culpability. But in principle, if there was something that suggested that he was particularly culpable and knew things that he didn't admit to knowing, then I would have absolutely no hesitation at all in saying that his peerage should be removed. I think we've had this culture for far too long when people simply are able to shrug and get away with stuff. And when we've got just so many scandals of this kind that have happened in recent years, whether that's Hillsborough, whether it's the post office scandal or this, there are big cultural systemic issues that need to be addressed within Westminster, within Whitehall. Some of that we discussed today in the debate around things like a legal duty of candour on absolutely everyone involved in public bodies and in government and so forth. That's positive going forward. But I still think that those people who have fought for 40 or even 50 years sometimes to try to get justice on this would want to see some kind of justice being done for people who have lied and got away with it in the past. And if that means a peerage going, then so be it.
Isn't the problem in situations like this that it's often deputy heads that roll rather than the people at the top of the tree?
That's a political choice, isn't it? So if we can demonstrate, and as I say, obviously it's 7 volumes, I haven't read all of it, but if there's sufficient evidence in Sir Brian's report to suggest that heads at the top of the tree should go, then they should.
Heather Wheeler.
Yeah, this is all a really, really difficult case, isn't it? And my heart goes out to all of the families involved. And what I found really fascinating about the people that had taken the blood, were given it by the doctors in good faith, it's a classless crime. People, very rich people got it, very poor people got it. There isn't anything that's specific about an area or a geography area or anything like that. It was just horrendous right the way across the board. I'd forgotten that Anita Roddick had died from it. Just astonishing, the people that had got involved. So getting back to the point, Ken Clarke, in every job he ever took on, was just one of those very bullish guys. And I don't know that he ever had any doubts in his life about anything. And so when you bring that to the political field, you just bat everything away with that mindset. He
had doubts about Mrs. Thatcher.
No, I'm not going to say why that is. Okay. Do you know what? He was wrong. There you go. So I can say that about Ken Clarke. He was wrong about Mrs. T. So,
but to say, well, he was bullish and didn't have self-doubt about anything, well, fair enough. But the point here is that it was known for some time that the blood that was being imported from America, predominantly from American prisons, was infected. And yet, and it wasn't... I don't actually necessarily blame the politicians here. You have to blame the people who advised the politicians that this was okay.
Yeah, I agree.
And I don't know if any of you were listening to this, but I heard on the Today programme about 3 or 4 weeks ago, a professor of epidemiology, was it? Something like that, who seemed to still stand by the original decisions. And I'm thinking, am I hearing this correctly?
I should clarify. Yeah. I'm not here to defend Ken Clarke, but nonetheless, his claim at the inquiry was the decision wasn't made at his level. And the claim against him was, but you said there is no evidence, or there's no conclusive evidence, or something like that. But that in itself is just what was said by his predecessors as Health Secretary and his successors as Health Secretary. Now, in Scotland, the charge is somewhat different. Scotland didn't import the material from America because Scotland was self-sufficient in blood supplies. But what the Scottish Health Service did was they continued to take blood from prisoners after it was known that the prison population was heavily infected with drug-related blood conditions, and there was a delay. It's difficult to estimate how much, but perhaps a year, perhaps 2 years. So the Scottish victims were, in the main, self-infected, apart from the children at York Hill Hospital, where the blood was imported for a specific reason about paediatric care for children with leukemia. So this failure to report or to own up, and this desperate wish to conceal things afterwards was systemic through the civil service. I suppose what you could say about ministers, if they didn't know, they should have known. But even after it was known that these things had been wrong, there was resistance against this public inquiry. And although Penrose in Scotland didn't get to the bottom of what Longstaff had done, at least it had the effect, of course, that when Penrose reported back in 2015, that's when David Cameron made the apology.
Steve Charles
coming.
Yeah. Well, I think two things. So I sit outside of Parliament, unlike
at the moment, Steve.
and the reality is that I lead a large organisation that works with several departments of government, and the culture of cover-up, of not accepting liability, of shifting the blame, of not being the guy that gets caught holding the parcel when the music stops. And it's driven by our increasingly our society that is increasingly absolutely scared of accepting liability for anything. So what I'd say is behind Whitehall and civil servants I work alongside sit a whole bunch of lawyers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the lawyers are employed to make sure that you've not got your name on anything and you can shift the blame. And it is a cover-up culture that exists in our system. It's been there for a long time. But the other thing I want to say is that Perry Evans, whose wife, Heather, has been in the news today. I've seen her on the television, heard her on the radio. Perry died 5 weeks ago. I've known Perry for 35 years. Heather worked for Oasis Trust, the organisation I began, for many years until she left us to nurse Perry in the last couple of years of his life. But then he succeeded and he lived through it and he lived through it and he lived through it. But 5 weeks ago, yesterday, he died. And what we mustn't forget is the human tragedy of lawyers who exist simply to make sure that the blame never stops with the guy they're responsible.
And we should also not forget that every week, 2 victims of this scandal die. So any more further delay in the compensation, of course the procedure for that was outlined in the Commons today, will be disastrous for that many families.
And I heard Heather interviewed on the Today programme on BBC, if I can mention them here this morning. And she was asked the question by the presenter, and it was, do you have faith that this compensation package will actually be paid out in good measure, hastily? And she said, we've been promised and promised and promised, and I'm still not sure.
Caroline?
Well, I was going to say, I think John Glenn did a good job this afternoon. I believe he will do his best, but I think it's interesting that even this government, who appeared to be taking this more seriously, had an opportunity a year ago when the second interim report was published last April, and a number of us at the time were saying, set up the compensation scheme now. And even still, this government wouldn't do it then. So although 1 year, after 40 years or 50 years, doesn't seem so much, as you say, given that every single day people are still dying, then lives could have been saved even in this last year, even with the same ministers we've got right now, if they had acted faster.
Yeah, I don't think that's quite fair. And thank you for saying John Glenn's done a good job, because he has done an absolutely amazing job. Yeah. So he's heart and soul into this. Yeah. So the point is, he's got the support of the Chancellor of the Exchequer to do it. So please don't forget that
why wasn't it done a year ago?
Hold on. Some money has already been paid out. Some of the 100,000s have already been paid out. So others will get, within 90 days, 100,000 as a down payment. And the people that have previously had 100,000 will be able to have the appropriate top-ups.
True, but it could have been done.
No,
it could have been done a year ago.
No. You've got to do it by the law.
There was an interim report where Sir Brian was asking for it to be done a year ago.
Well, I think money coming out in 90 days for this government, for any government, is hugely impressive.
When there's the political will,
and have me back on in 90 days.
Really quickly.
No. 90 days is a huge forward movement.
But you can put legislation through in a day if you want to.
Yeah, well, it's been done.
You can, but you've got to do the back office stuff.
For less good reason. Very quickly, reflect on the resolve, the dignity, the endurance of the campaigners.
Absolutely.
But secondly, I mean, I'm going to say once again about Langstaff. Finally, somebody's been in charge of a public inquiry. He's seized it and he's taken it to
and
the
he got a
nth
standing
degree.
ovation from the victims. Have you ever seen that happen before?
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible.
It was
Well, on that high note, let's move on to another subject in a couple of moments.